we're anxious to get started this morning. We got two great program segments this morning, followed by one of our favorite times, which is giving out the awards at the awards luncheon today. So we're excited to have my friend Jeff Rosenberg, who's on the board of the Mississippi Historical Society from the Gulf Coast, who will be moderating this session. So let's give a warm round of applause for Jeff Rosenberg.
Well, good morning, everyone. As Brother mentioned, I'm Jeff Rosenberg. I'm the Historic Preservation Coordinator for the Department of Marine Resources, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's first session and our third session of the conference, which is entitled Environmental History of Mississippi. I'll introduce our speakers, brief bios, and then ask that we hold all questions till the end of this session. Our first speaker this morning comes from Dustin Wren, a social studies teacher at Itawamba Agricultural High School in Fulton, Mississippi. He earned a graduate degree from the University of Mississippi and a master's degree from Missouri State University. Among other courses, he has taught U.S. history and Mississippi studies. And today, he'll be talking about Andrew Jackson's Military Road. Our next presenter is Chris Slocombe, the Assistant Director of Admissions at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. Originally from Worcester, Massachusetts, his hobby is reading and researching the 19th century American history. Today, he'll be talking about the siege of Corinth in the Civil War. Our third paper is by Maaarten Zwiers, Assistant Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He is a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi, and today he'll be talking about former Congressman Jamie Whitten. And last but not least is Charles Jones. Originally from North Carolina, he is a PhD student at the PhD student in history at the Mississippi State University. His focus is on environmental history in the South, and today he'll be talking about feral hogs and how this invasive species has impacted our environment. So look forward to enjoying all our speakers, and Dustin, would you like to join us on stage?
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to talk to you today about Andrew Jackson's Military Road. There we go. I want to talk to you about the military road that Andrew Jackson is responsible for getting constructed. As you can see, the road is this big dashed line here that goes from Nashville all the way to Madisonville, Louisiana. The idea is connecting Nashville to the city of New Orleans. There's already a road that does that, though. There's the Natchez Trace that was already used. As you can see, it goes from Nashville to Natchez, Mississippi, and then there's the river road that connects it basically to New Orleans in the same manner. So the question becomes, why do we need this road constructed? That becomes more clear in the aftermath of the War of 1812. For those who are familiar with it, in the War of 1812, this is the second time the United States has faced Britain. And we feel like for the second time we've pushed them away, we've kept America safe from British control. But that doesn't mean we feel necessarily safe. I kind of feel like this is one of the more missing chapters of history. Typically in our textbooks and stuff, when we talk about the War of 1812, we're like, okay, America's safe, it's secure. Let's start talking about the antebellum South, and let's start talking about the gearing up to the Civil War, which makes sense. But we kind of forget about how hard it is to settle the South, and we forget about the fears that were present for the people who lived in America at this time, especially the people who lived in this region. To them, there are still many threats. Britain still poses a threat. Now, in the hindsight of this, we know that Britain never invades America again, and Spain never poses a significant military threat, but at the time they did. Spain still controls the majority of land in the Americas. Britain controls all types of land out in the Caribbean. They still have access to Canada, of course, all that. And so we felt like we were surrounded still. We were surrounded by enemies. That's the mindset of our presidents, our politicians. That's the mindset of our generals for sure. On top of that, there was a lot of evidence that had been collected that Britain and Spain were both helping to fund and instigate Indian attacks in American frontier regions. So America does not feel at all secure from foreign invasion at this point. After the War of 18, or during the War of 1812, Jackson becomes the big hero for America. He becomes a rock star because he's the guy who swooped into New Orleans and saved the day. But even he knew that was almost miraculous in how that happened, because to get troops to New Orleans was a massive undertaking. The troops, to get to New Orleans, they have to go through all these swamplands, and so you're carrying these really heavy cannons and stuff, and you have to go through roads that are not very well built. I mentioned already that he used the Natchez Trace to some extent. When Jackson is sending his troops to New Orleans, the only group he sends down the Natchez Trace is the cavalry, just because they have horses. And he doesn't want to put them on boats. But instead of using the Natchez Trace himself, he takes his regular army, puts them on boats on the Tennessee River, sails from there to the Ohio River, and from there to the Mississippi River, and down to New Orleans for a lot of those guys. Because that route was quicker than taking the Natchez Trace for all those troops and all their supplies that they have to carry. So, to win a single battle, that's one thing. But if there is a prolonged war to take place on the coastline, there's a huge fear that we will lose the South to the British or the Spanish or whoever. And if we don't get this region settled by American citizens, that threat's never going to go away. So Congress says we've got to fix this, we've got to make it easier for settlers to get there, and we've got to make it easier to get our troops from the settled regions of like Tennessee down to these coastal areas. We've got to defend the port of New Orleans, we've got to defend the port at Mobile. This is a quote from Eleazar Willock Ripley. He will be a guy that comes under Jackson's command. They don't get along, but he will come under Jackson's command. And he says the South is Jackson's theater of glory. If you're the United States military, it's after the War of 1812, you need a hero to come in that understands this land better than anybody else. Who in your military understands this land better than Jackson, who has fought all these Indian wars in Alabama, who has been kind of in charge of this region anyways, and who has actually transported troops in this region? Nobody's going to be able to do that better than him. So Jackson's giving command of what's called the Southern District in the U.S. military, which honestly means all of the South and all of the Northwest Territories. The district he's in charge of as a military leader is enormous. He's going to be headquartered out of Nashville, which is where he's from anyways, but his headquarters there allows him to respond to anything like that might happen in like the Minnesota region of the country, or that might happen in the South region of the country. It's kind of centrally located. But even then, even the presidents, the secretaries of war that he's going to be under, they're all going to say, your attention needs to be on New Orleans, your attention needs to be on Mobile. That's where the real threat is, because we just don't have settlement there, and that's where they can launch attacks against us. The British Navy is still strong and powerful. So he gets to build a road. They're going to start construction in 1816. The U.S. government gives him $5,000. That is nowhere close to the amount of money he's going to need to construct this road. In man hours alone, just for the soldiers that they pay to do this, it's going to be over $12,000. They give him $5,000. Yeah, sure, go build a road through all of that. The idea is that this road will cut the distance of the Natchez Trace by 200 miles. The problem is all of those rivers. Mississippi gets wet, as we've seen. There's swamplands. These are just the major rivers. These aren't counting all the creeks and everything else that's going to be there. So as they start surveying this road, the surveyors have a horrible time. And these are just small groups on small horses, just going through and just kind of cutting their way through. But this road is going to be a bigger road than anything they had seen before. The Natchez Trace at most is around 6 feet wide. Indians, when they negotiated for routes through Indian lands, Indians never wanted roads to be longer than 6 feet wide because they didn't want wagons to travel through there. It was one thing for a hunter to come through. It was one thing for a traveler to come through, but if wagons come through, that means families are coming through. They didn't want that. But Jackson needs wagons if he's going to transport military supplies. This road's going to be 30 feet wide. So that means that much more forest land that has to be cut down, that much more swampland that has to be tamed. The wider bridges. He did say the bridges could be 25 feet, but they had to at least be that. It's an enormous undertaking, and if you know anything about the geography of Mississippi, it's almost impossible what they're trying to accomplish here. These rivers flood constantly. The swamplands and water dries up. Even the surveyors will have times where they will find themselves where they've camped out for the night. And these are surveyors, people who understand where the land is and the importance of the land and all that. The surveyors who camp out there will talk about how they wake up and they're surrounded and they have to swim back and find shore. It's just a miserable experience for everybody involved in this. In the end, we're going to have multiple bridges that are built, tons of causeways that are built. And so I actually have some of the drawings of the bridges here. They had a surveyor come through and he documented the bridges. The first image that he drew was how the causeways are constructed. You're looking at they're going to build about 25,000 feet of this. So the causeways are where they chop all these trees down, they take all the bark and stuff off them, and then they stack them up to build up a roadway. And then after they build that up, they're going to pile dirt on top of that. That's the causeways, 25,000 feet of that. And then these are the various bridges that you see. As you can tell, none of those bridges are even built the same way. We don't really know why. Nobody provides any reason for that. We don't know if it's because of just the individual on the scene says, hey, we're going to build a bridge like this. Or maybe they're trying to test out different bridge structures at the time. Or perhaps it's just, this is what the supplies we have on hand, and based on the topography that we're dealing with at this moment, this is how we need to build a bridge. If that evidence is out there as to why they're doing it, we haven't found it yet. But they build all these bridges, all these causeways. When they cut through this road, the point is what Jackson tells them to do is take your axes and cut every stump down to ground level, because we need a lot of wagons to travel through. And if you have stumps in the ground, the horses are going to get hurt and the wagons are going to bust their wheels. So we need to get all the stumps cut level on the ground, again, 30 feet wide for hundreds of miles, reaching from Nashville to Madisonville, Louisiana. It's almost an impossible task. To add a little bit to this, I know we're talking about environmental history today, but there is a lot of drama that goes on behind the scenes. Jackson is attracted to drama, apparently. This is one of the secretaries of war during this time is William Crawford. Jackson refers to him as a petty-frogging politician. He's not a fan. Where he has a problem with Crawford is Crawford keeps stopping progress on the road. Jackson's most trusted advisor is out there kind of laying out townships, especially in northern Alabama, as this is going on. And Crawford said, hey, we've got some problems. Some Indians are disputing some of these routes that you're using. You need to pause and do some diplomacy. He's like, look, I know you have the right to build the road through there, but we need to do some diplomatic stuff with the Indians here. Jackson, in his heart, believes that Crawford's just trying to delay the road, because Crawford is a politician from Georgia. And Georgia was already complaining about Mississippi fever. People from Georgia are flowing into Alabama and flowing into Mississippi, the southern portions of those states. And Georgia's worried about losing that population. And so he thinks Crawford is working with those rich people in Georgia to try to stop that, or at least slow down that tide. So he feels like he's getting in his way. General Ripley, who was a northern general, gets transferred to Jackson's division. General Ripley got caught in some type of personal dispute, and he punished a subordinate for a personal issue. And because of that, he gets in trouble. And they're like, well, Jackson, we're going to send him to you. And Jackson's like, I don't want him because I don't want somebody like that in my group. And Ripley's like, I don't want to go to the South. I don't know anything about the South. But the military says, well, that's what we're going to do. So neither one of these guys want to work together, and they get forced to work together. And as you might imagine, that doesn't go well. Ripley starts building side roads that Jackson never tells him to build. He delays construction on the road because he's like, look, Spain's about to invade us from Mexico. We need to get ready for that. And Jackson's like, yeah, they're not. Build the road. And so Jackson will send a supply team like, hey, the road should be at this point. Make sure you get supplies to these people up here. And then the supply team gets there and there's nobody building a road because they're on some side road building that. So they have to spend a few more days or weeks going and finding where the crew actually is. It's a nightmare. After a few years of this, things move slowly. After a few years of this, eventually Jackson gets Ripley out of his command. But when it's all said and done, he's like, look, that guy did more to slow my road's progress down than anybody alive. Like, I can't stand this guy. So there's always drama when you study Jackson. The memory of this road today bears some complication. Honestly, the road gets surrounded in more myth than it does in reality. A lot of the papers at the time were from that we have about this history are from Nashville, which is where Jackson is, which is where his buddies are. And if you were in like North Alabama, where Jackson had kind of gotten Florence started and got it propped up, these guys are big Jackson fans, and a lot of the stuff that you read is like, yeah, this road's going to be amazing. It's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic. And historians have kind of just run with that. They're like, well, if that's what they say, it must have been fantastic. It must have been amazing. And you can go through different parts where this road existed, and you can see historical markers that laud just how great this road was, and a lot of them are wrong. Like this one, for instance, says Andrew Jackson returned victorious from the Battle of New Orleans along this path to Tennessee after the War of 1812. No, they used the Natchez Trace to go back home. So that road didn't even exist then. So if you're responsible for that sign, I'm sorry. The road ends up that's not true. And it talks about how amazing it was for the settlement of Mississippi. And that's honestly the story I thought I was going to find when I started researching this paper. William Love wrote in the Journal of Mississippi History about how great this road was about 100 years ago. Talking about this road that was 100 years ago. He's like, you can tell that this road was amazing because the post office used it. And the post office wants to get mail delivered fast. So the only reason the post office would use a road is if it was an amazing highway. The post office did get assigned that road because, hey, it's Jackson's Road, you're going to use Jackson's Road. And then the Postmaster General gets all these reports back from his guys on the road, and they're like, there's not really a road there. Almost as soon as the road was being built, as they're even surveying, when they're surveying the middle portions of the road, they're like, man, that bridge was really shaky that I just went across. And they're like, hey, that causeway over there just got completely washed out. The postmaster's like, look, there's trees growing through the road. The fact that there's trees going through the road means nobody's using this thing, right? So I can't keep going through it if there's a tree there. So yes, the post office did officially use the road for some time, but they very quickly reverted back to the Natchez Trace. The road starts in 1816. It gets its construction completed in 1820. By that time, we had really shifted our perception of the British and the Spanish, and we no longer saw them as threats. Jackson would even launch an invasion into Spanish Florida and destroy a fort there and arrest some British officers that are there. We were no longer worried about the British or the Spanish by the time this happened. So geopolitics actually did shift at that point. Also, Mississippi and Alabama become states. Once they become states, the federal government no longer is on the bill for maintaining this road. It's the responsibility of those states. But the road mostly goes through Indian territory, and no settlers are going through there because it's Indian territory. So the states don't fool with the road. So the road, already in bad shape, just completely disappears in many places because there's nobody using it. We won't see major settlement in North Mississippi until after the Indian Removal Act and all of that. So history tells us one thing about the road, but reality tells us something different right now. Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Really excited to be here. Thank you so much for getting up early, having your coffee, and talking about environmental history. It's appropriate given the weather we got, right? Earlier today, we should have a session in the morning. My name is Chris Slocombe. I work professionally at Creighton University in Omaha, but I finished my master's degree recently at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And so this research that I'm going to present today about the Siege of Corinth is taken from that research. And I was joking with some folks earlier that I probably have the most depressing sounding title that we'll see today. So this quote actually comes from an Iowa cavalryman who was lamenting to his wife that the disease in the U.S. Army during the Siege of Corinth was so bad that he felt himself lucky to be alive in this, quote, land of sickness and death. And for just to give you a little bit of background about the Siege of Corinth, this is, of course, the campaign that took place right after the more famous Battle of Shiloh, one of the Civil War's big early fights in southwest Tennessee. And General Henry Halleck who Dr. Marslick knows well, having written his biography, is the federal commander as they traipse across 20 miles of relatively undeveloped land. This is very primitive land, very sparsely settled between Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River and in Corinth, Mississippi. This has a reputation of being a very sickly campaign, right? Most soldiers in Halleck's army during this time suffered from various levels of acute diarrhea, dysentery, typhoid, malnutrition, malaria, and in many cases, all of the above at the same time, right? So if you read anything about the Civil War, you know that this campaign is a sickly one. It is often noted for Halleck's timidity. This is a campaign that took almost 2 months in duration, and it is known as a sickly campaign with the U.S. Army. So my goal was to find out, use the lens of environmental history to find out what made this campaign so sickly. And that is, and I felt like the lens of environmental history could help me solve that problem. Okay? One principle that I took from, that I think is important just to get like a fundamental tenet of environmental history, at least as it relates to Civil War studies. It was posited by Tim Silver and Judson Browning a couple years ago, where Civil War soldiers lived in what's called a biological exchange with their environment. That essentially as humans act on the environment in turn acts on humans. There's an interconnected relationship there. So that's an important principle. But my research, I wanted to broaden the geographic reach of environmental interpretations away from a largely Virginia-centric approach. And I also wanted to increase the scientific depth of those environmental interpretations. Specifically, how soil is a disease vector, is a different type of disease vector in Virginia coast, for example, versus the Mississippi Valley. So that is exactly what my framework going into this. And I think it's important. I also wanted to introduce to the topic of Civil War soldier studies this idea of biological balance, or what physiologists refer to as homeostasis, right? We all know if we do not sleep enough, if we have poor nutrition, right? If we have poor health care, we are stressed out, the weather is bad, all of these things combine to play upon our health. And what I'm going to do today is really focus on the material aspects of the environment that are part of this biological balance. All of these things were at play during the siege. Soldiers were stressed out. The hospital infrastructure in Halleck's army was horrendous. But to illustrate the point, why that Iowa cavalryman considered the land one of sickness and death, I really want to focus on the material environment. And if you take one thing from this presentation today, it is that understanding disease at Corinth requires us to grasp how the land itself altered the biological balance of Halleck's soldier health. It's a really important piece. And I'm going to focus on three different types of, three different points of study. And I'm going to focus on weather first because it's the simplest, and I want to mention it too because it helps contextualize what I'll say also about soil and geology. From a top-down view, the campaign largely took place over two phases, the wet phase and the dry phase, where wet phase has just over half of the time is rain. It's incessant, the sky is dark, it is cold, it's a very wet spring. And at the end of the first week in May, it pivots to what's called the dry phase, where we have less than a third of that time sees precipitation. The weather turns. And notably, that dry phase, when it rains a little less intense. The sky is not as dark. So there's a pretty stark contrast here. And I created this weather calendar gathered from over 160 different manuscript sources all across the country to give you a sense, really on a day-by-day basis, what that weather looked like during the Siege of Corinth. And you can see after May 5th, right there starts to become large chunks of time in which there's little or no rain. And that has consequences when we start talking about soil and when we start talking about geology. Importantly, Halleck's soldiers in the wet phase were suffering from terrible shelter accommodations. They oftentimes had no tents, right? And then when it turned hot, their bodies were weakened from previous bouts of diarrhea, dysentery, and typhoid. So heat does things to a human body in that weakened state. So weather matters on its own, but I want to, I say that first to help contextualize these more admittedly complicated pieces, right? We all know, or at least I hope we all kind of appreciate that dirt matters, right? Many of us in central Mississippi know because our perhaps your house foundation has cracked, right? Because of Yazoo clay, it swells and shrinks and swells and shrinks, and we know that dirt matters. Dirt is a disease vector as well as a house foundation destabilizer. And that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit more about. As a quick introduction, this is the most basic thing I could find to help explain the three different types of soil texture that behave differently. We all know that clays behave differently than silt, and then of course sand is very different. Water percolates down through these soil molecules differently in sand than they do in clay. And this has consequences for the soldiers on top of that soil. And I think it's helpful, again, to go back to my Virginia example. I pulled some data from the U.S. National Resource Conservation Service, and this is just an example. About a little over a third of the Corinth area soil is made up of sand in the first overall profile and the first layer. In Virginia, it's approaching half. What that essentially means is that Corinth soils have higher amounts of runoff, and they stay wet longer, right? They're easily saturated. I also want to introduce the idea of a fragipan, and don't get distracted by these colors nor this amazing clarity that we have on this thing. Suffice to say, soil scientists are well aware of something called a fragipan, which these are all different types of fragipans, but they're all fragipans. And as you can see, the South is largely defined by fragipan soils. And fragipan soils are essentially, or what a fragipan is that about 1.5 to 3 feet down is a layer that is impervious to water. It helps perch water in the top layers. And Mississippi, and including Corinth, the Mississippi Valley is heavily fragipan soils. And you notice in Virginia, the coastal Virginia, it's not that way. So here's some tabulated data from the Siege of Corinth area, from the peninsula area. You can see the difference in the percentage of soils in the regions that are fragipan soils and that are not fragipan soils. So fragipans, especially if they are silty and clayey fragipans, feature high levels of runoff because there's nowhere for the water to move down into the soil. Right? So that, of course, has consequences on top of the soil. And Halleck's soldiers routinely wrote home in their letters. They said, "This is a sea of mud. We can't move. It is awful." They couldn't get dry. And a big part of that was the soil itself. So in summary for soil, the Corinth soils are very temperamental. They're easily saturated. They have high levels of runoff. And I talked to some soil scientists in northeast Mississippi that also said, and this is interesting, though it loses its wetness, its transition to dry can be quick. And when it gets dry, it's bone dry. And that's an important setup for the last part of my presentation today. But the last thing I want to mention about soil, just real quick, is that this mud and this yucky saturated thing, or this soil, it more easily, when it rained in the wet phase, it more easily flooded creeks that Halleck soldiers then needed to bridge and expend a lot of their energy tramping through mud and bringing wagons through mud. Their roads were not 30 feet wide, right? They also, and this is getting very human here, the high runoff washed fecal matter from the diarrhea-stricken soldiers into water sources with greater haste. So they more easily soiled their water sources. And the final thing I'll talk about today is geology and topography. And I actually had, this is a map that I created. It's a geological map of Halleck's advance from Pittsburgh and Hamburg landings to Corinth. And I had to trace geological maps from Tennessee and Mississippi because the geologists in both states did not think that anyone, they created separate maps, and it forced me to kind of collate the data. But as you see here, Halleck's army eventually moves into this middle ribbon of what is called the Selma-Demopolis Chalk. This is a geological formation of rotten limestone, the first layer of which is so porous that it sucks up water really quick. And Halleck moved across the Selma-Demopolis Chalk at the exact time that the weather switched from wet phase to dry phase. So what was a wet, muddy mess quickly turned into a situation in which soldiers could not find water. They began to dig wells, they were desperate, and they could not find enough water. They drank putrid water. One Wisconsin soldier called good water as scarce as honest men in Wisconsin. An Ohioan said, we can get a little dirty water close to camp, but it is not fit to wash out of. And men blamed the water for causing the diarrhea that was plaguing so many, but they had to drink it in that dry phase or risk dehydration. But drinking polluted water, as we know, makes one diarrheal, right? Good morning, everybody. And then finally, it bears mentioning, I mentioned earlier, the final, the primitive nature of the landscape itself, the wild nature of the landscape. Halleck's soldiers traversed this landscape and then not only had to go over creeks and go over the mud and everything like that, but they had to essentially carve a logistical network from that wilderness. Build roads, expand, bring wagons, bring heavy artillery. And the physical labor for such an enterprise can hardly be overstated. So when you expect the soldiers to work that hard, when they are drinking or eating inconsistent food, when they are malnourished, when they are drinking poor or scarce water, and when their bodies are already weakened from diarrhea and dysentery and typhoid, it is that constant exertion, that relentless exertion, that broke so many bodies down and created the sickness that we know occurred during the Siege of Corinth. One surgeon called it simply bodily degeneration. And he was correct. The longer the campaign ground on, and Halleck was very slow, he made sure he was going to capture Corinth. It was an unexciting campaign. One soldier called it a colorless campaign. I disagree, nonetheless. It was a slow campaign. The longer the campaign ground on, the longer the soldiers had to endure these nature-based stresses to their health. And they had to exist atop land that was ill-suited to sustaining them biologically. So Halleck's slow advance might have assured he captured Corinth, but in doing so, he submitted his soldiers to conditions that altered their biological balance, and the consequences were fatal. So to summarize here, understanding disease, again, requires that we grasp those aspects of nature and how they play on the biological balance of students, or of soldiers, excuse me. I work in admissions, so students just pops out of here. This is a website that I've created. Certain pages are up, certain pages are still under construction. But civilwarcorinth.org actually brings all this information together. So if you were to go on the website today, you would go and you want to plumb that weather database. You can see all 160 manuscript collections. You want to look into the soil profiles and the people that participated atop this land. You can do so. So I'm really excited with this public-facing element to bring environmental history and unite it with digital history to make Mississippi land speak during its most famous historic events. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good to be back. I was on the stage on Wednesday, so I'm starting to feel at home. For the History's Lunch series on Wednesday, I wrote a more formal paper for this event, titled Jamie Whitten in the World, the Agrochemical Mississippi Delta and its Global Entanglements. The research I will present today is part of a bigger project called Raceland, the Ecology of Segregation, which is a global and environmental history of Jim Crow in the post-World War II period. The Raceland project is based on the premise that the Jim Crow system not only exploited and destroyed human beings, but also the environment. Human and natural resources are systematically mined to uphold the ecology of segregation in the US South. This resource extraction happened through geopolitics and the entanglement with industries and commercial activities that were not always explicitly racial in nature. For instance, the implementation of the Marshall Plan in Europe, oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean sugar trade, and the development and application of pesticides and herbicides. And this production and use of agrochemicals and how this relates to race and the global will be the topic of my paper today. Civil rights historians have elaborately demonstrated the global aspects of the movement as part of a broader anti-colonial struggle against white control that intensified during the Cold War years. However, the segregationist opposition has received less attention from scholars that apply a global angle to study US race relations in the Cold War period. Researchers who are interested in international and transnational dimensions of Southern segregation often focus on Africa, where similar systems of racial separation existed. Because of the similarities between US Southern segregation and African apartheid, it is understandable that historians primarily concentrate on countries like Rhodesia and South Africa. But segregationists from the US South had a much broader outlook on world affairs than just the African continent. In that sense, the historiography on slavery in the antebellum South is more wide-ranging than the scholarship on segregation. Historians such as Walter Johnson and Sven Beckert have examined the worldwide networks between Africa, the Americas, Europe, and Asia Southern plants were part of. In his book, American Mediterranean, Matthew Pratt-Bottero examined how these planters to the US South belonged to an extended hemispheric brotherhood of slaveholders that was constantly thinking about the future of their system of labor. Such an approach inspired the methodological basis of the Raceland project. Like antebellum Southern planters, segregationist leaders were not provincial or backward-looking. Instead, they were globally engaged and very much committed to Cold War modernity in order to sustain their white supremacist worldview and integrate it into the reconfigured international playing field that arose after the Second World War. Jamie Whitten belonged to this group of globally committed segregationists. His political papers at the University of Mississippi document the many trips he took during his long career. Jamie Whitten was elected to Congress in November 1941, a month before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Second World War marked the end of the Great Depression, a 10-year global economic slump that led to more government intervention in the United States through the New Deal. The New Deal dramatically transformed agriculture in the US South. Many farm measures implemented by the federal government to counter the Great Depression in the southern states primarily profited the planter class. With the subsidies they received from Washington, plantation owners could buy new equipment, such as tractors and harvesters, which enabled them to cut back on labor costs. The fossil fuel-driven mechanization of the plantation led to the illegal eviction of tenants and the substitution of sharecroppers with wage laborers who were hired on an ad hoc basis. The agricultural initiatives of the New Deal had an obvious racial bias. 90% of sharecroppers in the region were black, and they reaped little benefit from the government's programs, especially in comparison to the big planters. Southern farmers who survived the Depression generally owned larger holdings, grew a greater variety of crops, employed fewer workers with more machinery, incorporated more scientific know-how, and looked to government for subsidies in their quest for parity. Historian Roger Biles summarized the change in the US South from a system of sharecropping to agribusiness and the rise of the neo-plantation, large-scale, capital-intensive, and fully mechanized farms. The revolution of plantation agriculture that started with the mechanization in the 1930s continued after World War II with the increased use of pesticides and herbicides, which further reduced the need for manual labor. By the mid-1950s, the business elite of Memphis marketed the city as the chemical capital of the Mississippi Valley to attract companies manufacturing agrochemicals. The Mississippi Delta was the right place for these businesses to settle because plantations in the area applied vast amounts of chemical products to boost yields. Cotton became the most insecticide-intensive crop after World War II. By the 1960s, it used 40% of insecticides in the country. Geographer Brian Williams describes his new way of farming in the Delta as an intensifying chemical regime of plantation production. Besides herbicides and pesticides, plantations hungered after fertilizers to beef up production. Ammonia synthesis plants emerged further downriver in Louisiana, for instance in the town of Loulin in 1954. And this facility is currently the biggest manufacturer of agricultural chemicals in the US. Fertilizers produced at these Louisiana plants were shipped upriver and applied in fields there. Excess nitrates subsequently flowed back into the Mississippi, causing algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico that formed hypoxic dead zones. In 1962, Rachel Carson's seminal work, Silent Spring, came out. It played a pioneering role in exposing the hazards of pesticides such as DDT and how chemical companies had systematically misinformed the public about their dangers. Southern planters took issue with the book. They depend heavily on the use of pesticides and herbicides to combat insects like the boll weevil and weeds. Because plantation regimes operate through the conjoint logic of ecological simplification, reorganization, and homogenization, to use the words of anthropologist Sophie Chow, plantations are very vulnerable to pest infestations. The plantation blog found a spokesperson in Congressman Jamie Whitten of Mississippi. In Washington, Whitten was known as the Farm Baron or the Permanent Secretary of Agriculture because of his powerful position on the Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee. Whitten was a strong supporter of Jim Crow, especially during the heyday of massive resistance in the 1950s and the 1960s. He said the Supreme Court's desegregation verdict in Brown versus Board of Education set the country on, quote, a downhill road to integration, amalgamation, and ruin. In 1956, Whitten signed the Southern Manifesto, a segregationist response to Brown that called for massive resistance against racial integration and state sovereignty in the organization of race relations. He voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and its extension in 1975. However, when the black vote became more powerful after the 1960s, Whitten distanced himself from a segregationist past. He said, quote, conditions change. You go with conditions as they are, not like what they used to do. Although the application of pesticides and herbicides does not appear to be racialized at first sight, in practice it frequently is, especially in a deep south state like Mississippi, where a large impoverished population of African Americans relied on work in agriculture. By the 1960s, however, the big plantations in the area no longer required a lot of farmhands. The mechanization of plantations that took off during the New Deal and the increased use of pesticides and herbicides in the Cold War era severely diminished the need for manual labor. Agricultural machines and toxins made hoeing weeds and picking cotton by hand redundant. This Cold War racial order of the Deep South plantation was a manifestation of what can be considered agro-environmental racism, which was destructive to both the regional environment and a decreasing number of often black farm workers who worked in the poisonous cotton fields without protection and whose vegetable gardens were frequently sprayed with toxins by crop dusters as collateral damage. For the big planters in the Deep South, the well-being of their farm products and the profits they made of selling them on the world market was often more important than the environment or human lives, in particular the lives of black workers. As an influential representative of this chemical regime of plantation production, Whitten opened an all-out attack on Rachel Carson with his own book titled That We May Live. It was an open celebration of pesticides and the companies producing these poisons. Whitten admitted that the cotton-growing Mississippi Delta region has one of the highest rates of pesticide application in the country. But he did not see that as a problem. Instead, he painted a picture of progress that celebrated mechanized and chemical-intensive plantation agriculture in the Delta. He wrote, "In the growing season, hundreds of motor vehicles and aircraft apply tons of insecticides to the cotton fields. The roar of spraying and dusting aircraft is as common as the noise of tractors. Such treatments are absolutely essential for the warm, humid climate of the Delta, produces an unbelievable number of destructive insects." Chemical multinationals such as Shell, Dow, Monsanto, and Cyanamid enthusiastically helped Whitten to write the book and get it published in 1966. And I'm always sort of fascinated by the cover of this book with these, they look like sort of panicky birds trying to get the hell out of there. Why he chose this cover. Besides the nascent environmental movement in the United States, personified by Rachel Carson, Whitten had another problem. The looming enactment of much stricter environmental regulations in Europe, which endangered the export of US farm products treated with herbicides and pesticides. In the late summer of 1967, Whitten decided to travel to Europe for a pesticide public relations offensive and to negotiate with the Dutch politician Sikkel Mansholt, also a farmer, who was then the European Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development. The Mississippi congressman particularly worried about new agrochemical laws being drafted in Germany, because other countries in Europe would probably follow the continent's economic powerhouse. Mechanized, chemical-intensive farming was the surest way to economic progress, Whitten thought. Unnecessary restrictions on chemicals would lessen their, Europeans' chances to improve their own economy and standard of living, he wrote Assistant US Secretary of Agriculture George Maaarten. The economic well-being of Europe was, quote, dependent upon substituting machinery, equipment, fertilizers and pesticides for human labor, which could then be utilized in industry. While in Europe, Whitten delivered a speech at the International Congress of Plant Protection in Vienna, Austria. His address stressed the importance and especially safety of herbicides and pesticides. He, for instance, compared fish kill in the Mississippi River with the health of fish in a lake in Sunflower County. According to Whitten, for many years, the persistent chemicals used on crops had run into streams which feed the lake. Nothing was wrong with the fish in the lake, however. Whitten continued, "The fish are fat, healthy and active, and yet these fish contain more than 40 times as much chemical residue from persistent chemicals as did the saltwater fish involved in the Mississippi River kill." With this example, Whitten wanted to demonstrate that no direct relationship existed between the intensive application of pesticides and mortality among wildlife. We have read of numerous instances of fish kill, yet the study shows this has occurred throughout history, he asserted. Why it caused their death, science does not know. The Swiss chemical corporation Geigy exhibited interest in translating Whitten's book into German, while Shell's international research company in The Hague, the Netherlands, wanted to facilitate a Spanish version of That We May Live. Both companies were invested in the petrochemical industry and the production of pesticides. They feared the impact of environmental activists like Rachel Carson on their business practices. Shell official Walter Appleby wrote the following to Whitten, and I quote, "I believe that the Spanish edition will be extremely useful in all Central and South American countries. This whole area is now waking up to the importance of agricultural chemicals, and your book will be of great help to them." A German and Spanish edition of Whitten's book appeared in 1969, titled Damit wir leben können and Para que podamos vivir. A year later, the Shell branch in Colombia reported how helpful the book had been in convincing agricultural agencies of the Colombian government to rethink placing restrictions on the use of pesticides manufactured by Shell, such as Aldrin, Dialdrin, and Endrin. It apparently is doing a much needed job right now. Agribusiness political relations consultant Donald Lurch informed Whitten. Whitten's associates did not limit their activities in Europe and Latin America. In early 1969, Donald Lurch visited Japan, where he learned from an agribusinessman that, quote, "the fear of pesticides is being fanned by a number of writers in the popular Japanese press." Although the attack on agrochemicals had not yet reached the same magnitude as it had in the United States and Europe, it is a matter of growing concern, he warned. Lurch told Whitten he discussed getting That We May Live translated into Japanese with one of his friends in the publishing business there. Shell representative Walter Appleby also traveled to Asia in 1969 to deliver a paper titled Pesticide Residues in Our Environment at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in New Delhi in India. Like Whitten's 1967 speech in Vienna, Appleby's objective was to emphasize the harmlessness of a pesticide like DDT, if administered correctly. He wrote to Whitten, "Purely agricultural uses are not likely to cause any significant hazard to fish and wildlife, and they are not likely to lead to serious pollution of the great rivers of the world." Whitten could not agree more. However, following Carson's pioneering work, scientists begin to find disturbing signs that organic chlorides like endrin, DDT, and its metabolite DDE were in fact very dangerous to wildlife. Pesticides used on plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana to control the cotton boll weevil, bollworm, and the sugarcane borer ended up in the Mississippi River and killed fish, turtles, and snakes, especially after heavy rains that caused runoffs from the fields. The pestiferous brown pelican was common along Louisiana's Gulf Coast until 1958, but 5 years later it had disappeared. An effort in 1975 to transplant pelicans from Florida to Louisiana led to more dead birds. This sudden and devastating die-off demonstrates the vulnerability of pelicans to endrin and emphasizes the possible role of insecticides in their decline, researchers from Texas observed. In similar fashion, death-dealing agrochemicals had a major impact on human beings living in the Delta. Crop dusters sprayed the insecticide calcium arsenate, which not just kills bugs, but also is harmful to vegetables, without much consideration to the gardens where black plantation tenants grew foodstuffs. A crop duster pilot recalled in 1972 how, quote, "the planters would tell us not to pay any attention to them, just go ahead and dust right over them. It would completely kill the gardens, ruin it." The chemical regime of plantation production of the Cold War Mississippi Delta created a racial ecology that led to species loss, racialized displacement of people considered by planters to be a burden, and attempts to globalize the agenda of the Delta agrochemical conglomerate, which happened with the support of petro multinationals like the Dutch company Shell. Through his travels and the translation of his book, Jimmy Whitten was an inherent part of this globalizing drift. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here today. Real excited to be with you. It's several tough acts to follow, but we're going to do our best to get you excited about pigs. All right, so to read the Operation Hog webpage from Mississippi State University's Extension Service, one can only come away with a degree of anxiety about the status of feral hogs in the Magnolia State. They state that, quote, "they are threatening our economy, farms, lifestyles, treasury places, and native wildlife. Wild hogs are pests, not trophies. They carry disease, destroy farmland and trees, and eat the eggs and young of wildlife like quail, white-tailed deer, wild turkey, and even songbirds. They don't belong here." The claim that hogs could have such a devastating impact on an entire state's economic and cultural welfare is a bold one, considering the feral hogs have existed in North America in some degree since their importation by Europeans in the 16th century. The rhetoric used by the MSU Extension Service reflects the severity of ecological and environmental damage inflicted by feral hogs. Recent estimates of national economic damages they cause totals nearly $2.5 billion, with $66 million of that occurring in Mississippi alone. Much of this damage ties directly to hogs' rooting practices for food, such as in agricultural fields where they feed on commodities like corn and soybeans, and on tree farms where they damage saplings. Wildlife biologists also articulate concerns of disease transference, both from feral pigs to domestic stock, as well as from pigs to humans, of diseases such as the pseudorabies virus, hog cholera, and swine brucellosis. Additionally, they fret over feral hogs' impact on native wildlife as not only competition for food sources, but sometimes as predators themselves. Feral hogs' destructive capabilities of crops, their competition for food sources with native species, and their predation upon native wildlife populations ensure their status as a nuisance species. This paper focuses on why feral hog populations spread so drastically in Mississippi between 1970 and 2010. In 1988, feral hogs existed in only 23 counties in the state, but by 2016 they were present in all 82. Even considering hogs' prolific breeding capabilities, in which a sow can produce up to 6 to 8 offspring per litter twice a year, and whose piglets can mature in as little as 6 months, reproductive capabilities alone cannot explain the rise of feral hogs at the end of the 20th and beginning of 21st century in Mississippi. It was neither natural population growth nor biological prowess that allowed these pigs to spread like wildfire, but rather the purposeful introduction of exotic wild boar from Europe that popularized wild hog hunting amongst Mississippi sportsmen. Intentional introductions of wild boar for the purpose of providing exotic hunting opportunities had consequences state wildlife officials did not foresee. During the 1970s, the Mississippi Game and Fish Commission actively released wild boars throughout the state. These animals were Eurasian wild boar, which are larger in stature than your standard feral hog. Wildlife scientists define feral as a previously domesticated animal that's escaped captivity and is living in the wild. Wild boar are non-native species that have never been domesticated. However, as historian Abraham Gibson has noted, feral can be used secondarily to mean wild, ferocious, or savage. So in this paper, when referring to truly wild species that are imported, I will use wild hogs or Russian boars. And I will use feral when discussing once domesticated livestock that now live in the wild, or the offspring of wild and feral pigs. In the March and April 1970 edition of Mississippi Game and Fish, the official magazine of the GFC, they profiled hog hunter and Mississippian James Walters. Walters, an Ole Miss grad, a Korean War veteran, and a Lowndes County attorney, embodied a masculine hunter. He described the thrill and danger of hunting feral hogs. Walters' description of his most dangerous encounter was not in the field hunting, but rather involved a sow he trapped and took home to fatten for a later harvest. Watts and a friend tied this hog into their car with some ropes, and inside the Jeep, it broke loose, wreaking havoc, as one might imagine. Wild hogs and feral hogs are not to be bound simply by ropes. As Watts stated, quote, maybe it's because the wild hog is the only animal I've found in Mississippi that will attack you, or because there are no regulations or limits on taking them, but for whatever reason, hog hunting is a real challenge and a great sport. As the official magazine of the NGFC, the timing of this article heralding the niche category of hog hunter was not coincidental. As if existing feral populations did not prove enough of a thrill for Mississippi hunters, Game and Fish Commissioner Tom Cleveland had plans to spice things up. In 1970, Commissioner Cleveland ordered a study of Russian boars to be implemented by Chief of Game and Fish Bill Turcotte. They received approximately 10 Russian boars from the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Georgia. Internal documentation proves inconsistent, as an undated internal report on this wild hog release program stated the commission obtained a permit from the State Board of Animal Health for 1 male and 6 female boar. But regardless of the precise number, the MGFC did import enough wild boars to breed and study in captivity. That same year, George Gibbs, a wildlife officer with the U.S. Forest Service, contacted the Chief of Fish Division, the Chief of the Game and Fisheries Division, to express the Forest Service's concern over the introduction of Russian boars in Mississippi. Gibbs noted the Forest Service had extensive experience dealing with feral hogs in the South, and he acknowledged while they certainly provided extra recreational opportunities for some hunters, that those opportunities only occurred at the expense of more desirable game and from other forest resources. He noted how various studies showed the negative impact on feral hog populations that they had on ecosystems, describing their competition with native species for food, their impact on timber growth by their eating seeds of mass-producing hardwoods, and the soil erosion caused by their rooting practices. He claimed they acted as a nuisance species to campers and other outdoor recreationists. They were also potential vectors of disease transference towards big game species and domestic livestock. His letter left no room for an alternative interpretation. The Forest Service vehemently opposed the introduction of Russian boars, wild hogs, in national forests. As Gibbs put it, quote, I hope this letter clarifies the Forest Service position on exotic species to supplement the hunting opportunities offered by native species. We simply don't need hogs when we have better opportunities to manage more desirable game species. Thus, as early as the 1970s, the MGFC was clearly made aware of the perils of introducing wild hogs in Mississippi. At a March meeting in 1971, the MGFC discussed the feasibility of stocking Russian boars throughout the state. Cleveland motioned for these Russian boars that were held by the MGFC to be pinned on the Copiah County Wildlife Management Area, or WMA, for study and propagation. These hogs would be disposed of at the will of the commission. They constructed a 40-acre pen to enclose the animals, and by the end of 1971 had released over 30 hogs into that WMA. The same day, one of the first inquiries from private citizens about obtaining these boars reached the commission. R.D. Thatcher, the secretary-treasurer of the Huntington Point Hunting and Fishing Club in Greenville, sought to acquire some of these hogs. As wildlife officials pushed hunting through their official magazine, demand for wild hogs from private interests was increasing. In early 1972, the MGFC reported they received permission from the Pearl River Reservoir Board to release 20 Russian boars in the Pearl River WMA. This was an important step, as the commission now actively released Russian boars on a second state-owned WMA, which extended the access of wild hog hunting to Mississippi sportsmen not equipped with the means to either land ownership or access to private hunting clubs. A month later, in the March-April edition of Mississippi Game and Fish magazine, the commission republished an almost decade-old article from a Mississippi newspaper, the Hattiesburg American, that exalted hog hunting. A Hattiesburg dermatologist named R.R. Lubitz had killed a 697-pound hog. And in discussing this dangerous and exciting hunt, Lubitz stated that, quote, "I didn't realize there was any animal in this part of the world that could charge a human, but I sure found out differently. That's what makes it a sport." The article concluded that those who had a desire for excitement and who hadn't tried hog hunting should give it a whirl. Indeed, as the MGFC sought to increase public enthusiasm of stocking wild boars for Mississippi hog hunting, they used their public-facing publications to introduce more hunters to the idea of hog hunting by using rhetoric that presented them as exotic, dangerous, and exciting creatures to hunt. After 2 years of maintaining the pen at the Copiah County WMA, Turcotte expressed concern over the financial burden of upkeeping these hogs. As of August 6, 1973, the pen housed 7 adult sows, all of which were ready to breed and could produce 30 to 40 hogs within days, 1 full adult boar, 4 gilts, a single 1-year-old male, and an additional 34 pigs immediately available for release. Feeding these hogs, Turcotte explained, took over 12 acres of sorghum production and 1,000 pounds of corn per week. With corn costing $3.21 a bushel, costs were adding up. Turcotte explained that he had contacted U.S. Forest Service agents and a Tennessee game biologist, and that while both believed that feral hogs were not cleared for introduction to the land, it would be feasible to give them to private landholders where they were wanted and could be maintained by hunting. Therefore, in Turcotte's best estimation, the best move was to release them to private landowners and hunt clubs. Turcotte argued that hunting clubs and landowners could assume responsibility for wild boar and control their population, and the commission could select the lands that were large enough to contain and support the hogs, where agriculture and timber were not the primary concerns of landowners. The MGFC heeded Turcotte's advice, and in 1973 began the distribution of wild hogs to private landowners. 15 wild boars were surrendered to private landowners in 73, 10 of which went to the Marigold Hunting Club in Bolivar County. Hog hunters were hardly the only group the MGFC's ownership of Russian boars were garnering attention from. Between 74 and 76, various groups published statements against the department's ongoing release of feral hogs, or Russian boars, and contacted the commission directly to complain of agricultural depredation that was occurring due to in pig populations. In 1974, Commissioner Cleveland informed his fellow commissioners about complaints of agricultural depredation by Russian boars in the Natchez Trace area. Cleveland claimed that deer were just as responsible for harm as hogs were, and that the hogs in question seemed to be, quote, feral hogs rather than Russian boars. As Russian boars and feral hogs interbreed outside of the limits of captivity, his assertion seems dubious at best. In December of 74, the Mississippi Association of Soil and Water Conservation's district commissioners adopted a resolution that strongly opposed further release of Russian boars in Mississippi. The MASWC Committee on Recreational Wildlife recommended a resolution which included familiar arguments about the danger of hogs, which included agricultural degradation, damage to young timber stands, and of course, disease transference. The resolution specifically targeted the MGFC and the stocking of Russian boars in and near the Barnett Reservoir. They countered Cleveland's assertion that this was not committed by Russian boar by stating that, quote, numerous sightings of European wild boar have been reported along the Natchez Trace area, parkway near the Barnett Reservoir. Their president, Ray E. Terman, criticized the MGFC's lack of, quote, comprehensive scientific studies sufficient to determine the possible effects of imported fish and animals on native Mississippi fish, wildlife, timber, agricultural crops, and other vegetation. Thus, their call was twofold. One, they wanted the MGFC to destroy the remaining wild boars that were still available, and no additional boars to be imported to Mississippi for stocking or studying purposes, as well as for the Mississippi legislature to pass stricter legislation to control the import of exotic fish and game species. In 1975, journalist Louis N. Hodges Jr. of the Biloxi Sun-Herald brought these debates to a much broader public audience. His report shed light on the fact that MGFC had been raising and releasing exotic boars to landowners in Mississippi for 6 years, reporting that, quote, GNF officials say from breeding their 11 sows and 2 boars, they have stocked private clubs with over 200 to 250 boars. Cleveland claimed that although the commission offered free hogs to landowners and private hunting clubs, the commission itself had made no releases. This, of course, was a gross misrepresentation of the facts, as not only had the commission released Russian boars on the Copiah County and the Pearl River WMAs, they also gave these hogs to landowners, which in and of itself is a form of release. Cleveland acknowledged the contention between hunter advocates and opposing groups, but he brushed off criticism, stating that, quote, all I'm saying is they have their place. According to Hodges, Cleveland indicated that even though the MGFC had not actively publicized the program, there was enough interest in wild boar hunting they could hand out 1,000 hogs per year. Hodges also noted that officials he contacted could produce no records of where and to whom the commission had released these boars. Hodges in the article noted the opposition of groups such as the MASWC, the Mississippi Wildlife Federation, and the Mississippi Forestry Association. All of these groups advocated for the destroying of remaining stock boars due to their potential harm to native flora and fauna, agriculture, and young timber stands. Yet the 1980s proved the beginning of a drastic change in the way the state wildlife agencies thought about Russian boars and feral hogs. In 1979, the MGFC was reorganized into a new organization, the Mississippi Department of Wildlife Conservation, or the MDWC. With this new organization came new commissioners and strict qualifications for leadership. And by 1981, Tom Cleveland was no longer a commissioner. The change in the MDWC's thinking towards feral hogs may be best demonstrated through an exchange between Lon Strong, their executive director, and Frank Davis, member of the board of directors for a newly formed interest group, the National Hog Hunters Association. In a letter to Strong, Davis recognized the MDWC's opposition to non-native game species, noting that he remembered, quote, the European boar program in the Tom Cleveland days, and that, quote, I can imagine the special interest group formation is not exactly going to make your day, end quote. Davis was not advocating for the MDWC to resume stocking wild boars. However, he did articulate his group's desire to perpetuate wild hogs where they presently occurred, expand their range where feasible, and most importantly, upgrade the wild hog population through the infusion of European blood into the feral hog population. He noted that, he quote, I found that since deer have become so common, many hunters appreciate a different, more exotic animal to hunt. Indeed, the rhetoric of exotic and dangerous hunting opportunities echoed in outdoor media in the 70s helped motivate subsequent generations of hunters to create a special interest group dedicated solely to the hunting of wild and feral pigs. Strong's reply demonstrated the updated policies of the MDWC. He noted that while the addition of another special interest group certainly complicated matters, that neither feral hogs nor feral hog hunters were going anywhere anytime soon. Thus, the best policy would be cooperation. He firmly expressed that he could not and would not, nor would his organization, favor the release of European wild boars in the Mississippi landscape because of their potential disease transference. He further argued that introduction of these boars would do very little to change the genetic makeup of the current population, as in conversations with Ron Fox, the chief of wildlife of Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, experienced that they grew larger, feral hogs populations grew larger and actual meaner than European hogs anyway. In 1985, then, the MDWC was echoing the similar concerns various groups previously cited when the MGFC spread of wild boars back in the 70s. In 1992, the now MDWFP's chief of game, Bill Thompson, sent out surveys to conservation officers and wildlife area managers with instructions to gather more information on feral hog populations. He noted their department had little research to indicate the status of feral hogs, including their general condition and food habits. And to Thompson, as hunters continued showing interest in these pigs, coupled with their, quote, continued introduction of wild hogs into new areas, more information was needed to determine feral hogs' impact on the environment and native wildlife. Hunters were moving feral pigs, and the MDWFP was concerned. In December of '98, they conducted follow-up surveys to compare the data. Their data showed a tremendous increase in the amount of hogs harvested, with over 30 hogs reported killed in the second survey compared to only 4 in the first. Though the survey asked key questions including if hogs were released, where from, and how many were killed, this data really only provided a fraction of information, as by 1993, Mississippi made the release of feral hogs illegal, and thus it's unlikely these hunters, or many of them, would willingly admit to breaking the law. As the 21st century dawned, state wildlife officials in Mississippi began adjusting their public-facing rhetoric on feral pigs. In 2002, the MSU Extension Service promoted aggressive hunting of feral hogs for the sole purpose of species management, focusing on data that proved their agricultural degradation while also acknowledging hunters' role in spreading them through the state. Though wildlife biologists argued for aggressive hunting, game laws prevented year-round hunting by non-landowners, as only those with access to private land could legally dispatch feral pigs outside of other big game seasons. As of 2007, hunting was still being touted as the primary weapon against feral hogs, as extension scholars, graduate students, and wildlife biologists continued to research wild pig habits. Now, by 2010, the MSU Extension Service had partnered with the USDA to provide outreach to landowners for best practices in culling hogs, which had now shifted from hunting to trapping and euthanizing as their primary method of control. Today, feral pigs are considered both prizes and pests, depending on who one asks. Their existence in Mississippi provides sportsmen opportunities to hunt trophy animals in an exhilarating experience while simultaneously serving as environmental stewards by helping cull destructive feral hog populations. The necessity of that environmental stewardship is partially due to the intentional importation and spread of wild boar by the NGFC in the 1970s. In their quest to relocate feral pigs to establish exotic and dangerous hunting opportunities, they helped drastically accelerate the population growth of spreader hogs that today wildlife biologists and farmers alike see as pests. The rhetoric employed in modern iterations against feral hogs reflects the serious environmental and economic damage their populations inflict. Indeed, according to Operation Hog, they don't belong here, but they are here. They've been here for some degree for centuries and have not posed a significant problem to humans until the late 20th century. And feral pigs, despite humanity's best efforts, are here to stay. Only by recognizing the challenges of feral hog populations in the context of the historical factors in which they arose can we glean lessons on how to prevent future unintended consequences from the introduction of non-native species for recreation. The history of feral hogs in the 20th century and the early 21st century should serve as a warning against the hubris of purposeful human introduction of non-native species for the benefits of few to the detriment of possibly many. Thank you.